So one of the biggest names in psychology from a popular culture perspective, obviously, is Freud. I guess, what would you say Freud had right looking back now? And what would you just say, Freud had, some things unequivocally wrong? How would you critique Freud, today?
Freud certainly had the idea of the unconscious mind right, and the idea that people are often motivated by conflicts or that they're not aware of, motives that they're not aware of, emotional traumas or whatever. That's unquestionably, that's so much accepted, I think, now that we'd find it hard to imagine people in any other way. The problem of sexuality is one of the things I'm not very sure he got right, and nor were quite a lot of his followers, because, well, the way I think of it is, if we were living in a society where eating was something you had to do privately and secretly, you'd get obsessed with eating, wouldn't you? Mm-hmm. You'd think about it, it would be taboo, it would be one of those things that you kept secret. In the society he was in, sex was like that. It was one of those things, it wasn't talked about, it wasn't, expressed. So not really surprising that he found a lot of his patients were kind of obsessed with sexuality or had issues of sexuality. And the other thing, which I think I do mention in the book, is the fact that most of his female patients had memories of being sexually molested as children. And what we have been finding over the years is that was a practice that was much more common than we realise. And so it's possible. At first he thought they were telling the truth, and then he was convinced that they couldn't all be telling the truth. There couldn't be that much sexual abuse of children going on. So he thought, well, if it's not true, it must be unconscious wish fulfillment. And hence, that fed into his theory about how sex was the prime motivator for everything. I wouldn't agree with that in the slightest nowadays. I think for some people, of course it is, but for other people it's different. But the unconscious mind, that was a big step.
Yeah, because to your point, it's like he baked everything down, particularly for men, to be the Oedipus complex, as you noted in the book.
Yeah.
And I know this is an oversimplistic view of Freud, but my critique of him is it seemed like he was always mansplaining in his view of psychology, which was that, like, sex is God, and therefore we can explain everything through sex, which I don't doubt whether there's some males that believe and think that. I just don't think that applies to all of humanity. And I think that was my primary critique of, as I was reading your book of Freud.
No, I agree with you. I think that's absolutely right. And I went to a very interesting lecture about Freud's inherent sexism as well, and the way he regarded women. But unfortunately, what I didn't do was take notes and take enough notes to be able to draw from that information in my book, because I have made very sure that what I've said I can substantiate. But I was quite shocked when I read the original Freud account of little Hans. And what you had there was a child who had been clearly traumatized by an event that had happened as he was out walking with his nurse, where they had these horse-drawn buses, and this horse had just collapsed in the street, made a lot of noise, and the child was terrified. And yet Freud had to convert that into a sexual thing. And it was very straightforward as far as I could see. I read that whole account in the original, and no. Well, I say in the original, in translation, obviously.
And what did Brewer bring that was different than Freud?
The talking cure. What he identified, well, what he realised was that sometimes things get better just by talking about them, Sometimes actually being able to surface these things helps you. And that's the basis of an awful lot of counselling therapy nowadays. It's one of those ongoing insights. And people... Well, if you had a society which assumed that the mind was always rational, there'd be no need for that. Once you know there's an unconscious mind, and that what appear to be physical illnesses or physical problems can be solved by psychological treatments, and they come from the unconscious mind, that's revolutionary in itself. And that's what Brewer brought to the party. And Freud worked with him, learned from him, was they had a very positive relationship for quite a while. And I think that's really been one of the things that's helped us no end over the years.
I was just going to say, the other thing that Brewer brought out was, we noted earlier that the mind is highly adaptable. Doesn't also the talking, the kind of the client as the center and the talking method that he brought, wouldn't that also allow the mind to think about how it needs to adapt? Is that a fair way of thinking about that therapy that he brought to the fore? It allows the mind time to like sort all the details out in one place.
Yes. And get it in perspective and get it organised. And that's really very important. Absolutely, I agree with you there completely. I think that's what, really, if you talk to psychotherapists and psychologists, that's often what they're doing, really, is helping their client to restructure themselves cognitively, to reorganise how they feel about it, and to get it all out and put it in perspective. And from then on, they can find their own way.
Sure.
They can find their own solutions.
So can you teach us a little bit about the history of IQ tests? And can you, while you do that, can you also explain the problem that Alfred Binet was seeking to solve in France that was similar to the IQ tests?
Okay, it's riddled with politics, really, the IQ test. Binet, who started the whole game of trying to measure intelligence, was actually employed by the French government what they'd done was they'd set up special schools for kids who were what we would have called subnormal in a few decades ago, and now talk about having special learning needs or whatever.
Sure.
And what they did was to develop a scale based on what you could expect children to be able to do at certain ages. So at a certain age, they can say the days of the week. At another age, they can count to 100, that
Sure.
sort of thing. And he developed a test based on that, which meant you could tell more or less how normal a child, whether a child was up with the rest of its peers or whether it needed special schooling. And the reason he wanted to do a test like that is because, quite unlike today, what the parents of France in those days wanted was the special schooling for their kids, because it involved free board and lodging. They didn't have to pay for them, and free education. So they were trying to coach their children into appearing less capable than they were.
Bizarre incentive structure. Yeah.
Yeah.